Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first session of the fourth day of CCN. It's my pleasure and honor to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Andrew Saxe. Andrew is a professor and group leader at the Gatsby Unit for Computational Neuroscience and the Sainsbury Wellcome Center at CCN. His work is developing a fundamental understanding of learning in the brain. What he does specifically is that he analyzes the dynamics of deep neural networks. As we all know, deep neural networks have proven to be really a fruitful and powerful framework for neuroscience to understand learning more broadly, but at the same time, they are just tremendously complex and really hard to understand. And Andrew's work has been incredibly important and insightful in this kind of journey to try and understand what's going on in deep neural networks. Andrew's work has been extremely successful and highly recognized, and he has won many awards. To just name the most recent one, he was named the Blavatnik Awards in the UK finalist 2023. So we are extremely excited to have Andrew here with us today, and please join me in welcoming Andrew.
All right, thank you for that kind introduction, and I'm very excited to be here speaking to you all. So the jumping off point for me is our incredible capacity to learn. So almost no matter what you do, if you continue to do it, you'll get better at it. Maybe not this good, but you can at least improve. And I think learning is potentially critical to our theories of the brain and mind, because to the extent that learning underlies many of our behaviors, not all of our behaviors, but many of them, then if we can construct a theory of learning, that could provide quantitative insight into many phenomena. And if you look at some of the key textbooks in the field, like Principles of Neuroscience, so in 1981, that was 468 pages long. In 2012, it was 1,747 pages long. So if you're an experimentalist, this is great news, very impressive, congratulations. If you're a theorist, though, maybe this is not exactly what we might hope for. We might hope that if we were really learning principles, we could start to compress things down. And my hope is that understanding learning will be one of these routes to compression. And if we look over in the engineering disciplines, we've started to see some of this. So the same systems that can recognize cars and images or pedestrians and so forth are also capable of, for instance, playing the game of Go at nearly human levels. And so there has been something of a convergence in the engineering disciplines. And of course, what those systems share is they are based on artificial neural networks. And so there's a potential, at least, for some convergence here as well. Connectionist models in psychology rely on those. Some of our models in theoretical neuroscience rely on artificial neural networks, and most of our present-day machine learning relies on them. So if we can understand how they work, we might get some broad insights into the phenomena across these various areas. Okay, so what is this going to take as a research program? Well, I think it takes three categories of projects, well, probably many more, but I'll divvy them up into three. The first thing we have to do is just take deep neural networks on their own terms and understand how they behave. Build a mathematical framework for understanding what they do. And then we can maybe take those mathematical insights and add assumptions that come from specific domains, like maybe you're interested in perceptual learning or semantic cognition. And you can add additional assumptions to turn those general theories into predictions for given experimental domains. And then we would want to conduct those tests and start a feedback loop between theory and experiment, right? So today I'm going to tell you some of our work in these directions. I'm going to start off with some theory. So apologies, I know it's 8:30, but I'm going to drag you through some mathematics for the first section. But then the payoff, hopefully, is we'll show how you can use those general principles to model human semantic development, and finally also look at an experiment testing some of these ideas in mice, learning over a period of several weeks. All right, so first let's talk about the computational level. So what is the impact of depth, and why does this matter? One thing that you can note when you train a shallow network versus a deep network is that it changes the learning dynamics substantially. So here I have a shallow network. It has no intervening stages of processing, just a bunch of input units connected to output units through these weighted synaptic connections. And if I train this network on some task, you might see that the error drops roughly exponentially. This is a very simple shape of the learning curve. Everything proceeds straightforwardly. However, if I take a deep network, just add some intervening processing stages, and train this network on the exact same task, now we see that there's actually a much more complicated learning trajectory with lots of little plateaus followed by stage-like drops before it eventually gets to zero training error. So depth can complicate learning. And we'd like to understand why and what it might bring as well. And this is a broad problem in the field. We often are building these models that are something of a black box. And we make choices about the data, the architecture, and the algorithm. And we usually run computer simulations then to see what will come from a system with those properties. And we're interested in, for instance, maybe the training speed of the system or its ultimate performance or the representations it has. But what we would ideally do, as a matter of theory, would be to directly connect the quantities on the left here to the quantities on the right and get some understanding of how these choices map across these scales. So, of course, I wish I could answer this for general deep networks, but I can't. So what I'm going to do is take a strategy of surrogates. So I'm going to analyze simpler models that are not the actual system we care about, but that hopefully retain some of its properties. And this approach might be familiar from physics. There's lots of cases where we study a simplified setting to get some qualitative insight into how the system works. And I think for the brain sciences, this is quite important, because even though the simplified model won't perform well on a real-world task, you can often get some conceptual clarity and clear predictions that arise from this simple model. All right, so now let me introduce this first simple surrogate model. Here we have a deep neural network. It has several layers of processing with weighted connections between them, collected in these weight matrices W. And the tricky piece in most deep networks is we apply nonlinear functions at each layer that make the analysis difficult. So I'm going to do something quite drastic and just strip out all of the nonlinearities. And this will be our first surrogate model. This is a deep linear neural network. And what this network can compute is basically just a product of weight matrices. So this product of the weight matrices is what a deep linear network will compute. And it applies that to some input x. And it might be trying to produce some target output y. And it will do that by minimizing, for instance, the squared error, as I've written here, between what the network produces and the targets over some data set. And this minimization problem is the learning problem for this network. Now, it turns out, if you stare at this for a second, you'll see that even though this is a linear neural network, this optimization problem is non-convex once you have one or more hidden layers. So even though the network only ever represents a linear input-output function, we've plugged that into this nonlinear error function. And when we minimize it, we've arrived at a non-convex problem. So this is a little toy model of non-convexity. And the gradient flow dynamics, which I've written down here, I won't take you through them, but the only point to make is that they are quite complicated, and they depend on the depth of the network. And so our goal will be to understand the dynamics of the system as a function of the data set statistics and other properties of the learning setting. All right, so a deep linear network, unfortunately, is still too complicated to really give you a concrete intuition. So I'm going to simplify it even further. We'll start with a linear chain. So here, this is a chain, just a single neuron in each layer. It receives a 1 as its input, just a number, scalar. And it's supposed to produce 2 as its output. That's all. And there will be d layers of weights. And then each of these layers, I'm also going to assume, for simplicity, that the weights start at the same value. So instead of there being a different weight in each layer, they're just all going to start at the same value. So we're going to track the value of the weights as this quantity b. And this is now simple enough that I can actually show you the error surface for this 1D chain. This is a real error surface. As a function of depth here, that's d. And what you can see is that for the shallow network, we just have this nice quadratic bowl, all right? So what this means is on the x-axis here, we have the layer weight in our 1D chain. And on the y-axis, we have the error that the network achieves if it's got that layer weight. And you can see that it has a nice global minimum if it's a shallow network. However, these deeper networks have this very different structure. Depth introduces a saddle point at the origin, and there's a plateau next to that saddle point before eventually dropping down to the global minimum. And the consequence of that saddle point and the plateau next to it for the learning dynamics are that when you run it, you'll see that the shallow network very rapidly hits the minimum, whereas the deeper networks are stuck on that plateau for a while. And they do eventually learn, but it takes them a while to expel from the plateau, and so you get these sigmoidal learning trajectories. Initially, they're stuck on the plateau, then they have a sharp, fast transition to learning. Now, I won't say too much about it, but I'll just note that, in fact, this is a simple enough model that we can solve for what the weights are over learning, and we have explicit expressions for them in terms of the data set statistics. And just to show you what those look like again, the weights in a shallow network are basically doing exponential approach, whereas the weights in deeper networks are doing these sigmoidal transitions. When you go to very deep networks, it sort of changes the shape a little bit, but it's still broadly a sigmoidal transition in this model. OK, so that was a 1D chain. Now, that's very far away from any practical system, but there's good news. The good news is that a full network just acts like several 1D chains. Not an obvious fact, but it turns out that there's situations where this is true. And so everything I just told you applies to a full network, except you need to think of it as several of these 1D chains running in parallel. And what that means is, for instance, in this deeper network, one of these chains might go through its sigmoidal transition at one point, another one might go through it at a later point, and so forth. And so the whole network, you'll see several drops as each of these 1D chains expels from its associated saddle point. In a shallow network, however, you're always just seeing exponential approach. So again, you've got these independent 1D chains, but they sort of all will rise roughly together because they have this exponential shape. OK, so this is just a very brief primer on deep linear networks, showing some of their core features. And the main lesson that emerges from it is that depth can introduce stage-like transitions. And this occurs when you start the network with small weights, and that places it near the saddle point, near the origin. And each of these drops corresponds to expelling in one of these directions. And for the aficionados in the audience, the way you see these 1D chains is with a particular change of variables, which reveals this decoupling. So it's not as though there's actually just a 1D chain of individual neurons. It's blended across the network, but the effect is the same as having independent 1D chains. All right, so intuitively, the picture emerging from a deep linear network about the process of learning is that depth introduces a hierarchy of saddle points. And it really is a hierarchy. What I mean by that is there's several saddle points. Each of those saddle points, some of the 1D chains have learned, and others have not yet learned. Okay? And that's the sequence of saddle points you go through, several of these 1D chains expelling. And so you can sort of visualize it like this. You have a lost landscape with lots of saddle points, and a trajectory will sort of go nearby several of them as it proceeds. And I should emphasize, this is a visualization. I can't show you a real loss surface in high dimensions, so you have to think of this as, maybe a conceptual picture, but it's not an actual picture of a real network. The other thing that this landscape might make you appreciate is that there can be individual variability here. So in particular, in this landscape, there's a hierarchy of saddle points, but which side of the saddle point you fall off could depend on small random initialization effects. And so you can have situations where the different individual learning networks will take different trajectories through this space. It's still sculpted by this hierarchical structure of saddle points. So there's this interesting mixture of some individual variability, but also some systematicity in the sequence of strategies that the network passes through. All right, so that's all with deep linear networks. Now let's take one step up in complexity and start talking about nonlinearity. All real-world tasks are nonlinear, so we would ideally like something that we can apply to nonlinear tasks. And I idea that I'll introduce here is based on the idea of gating. So if you think of a rectified linear neuron, which is used quite often in artificial neural networks, it's basically either linear or it's off. So we're going to use this fact as a loose inspiration to think about the effect of gating, because you could view that as basically a linear network that is either present or gated off. And so what we can do is consider paths through our neural network and ask, are all of the neurons along that path active on a particular example, or is one or more of them inactive? And if it's active, then this pathway will participate on this particular example, and if it's inactive, it just falls out. So maybe some other pathway is off on this particular data set example. And the intuition here, I won't take you through the detailed math, but the intuition is that when active, each pathway behaves like a deep linear network. So everything I've just told you about the deep linear network transfers to some extent to this setting. The new thing we have to add now is it's not looking at the whole data set statistics. It's just looking at the data set that that particular pathway is active on, which could be a filtering of the full data set. So you're sort of learning lots of linear models, only a subset of which are active on any given input example. All right, that's a bit abstract. Let me try to make it concrete with a little example. Suppose you have a network trying to solve the XOR problem. It's the canonical nonlinear task. We have a single output, we have two inputs, and we have these 4 data points. These 2 are supposed to be classified as negative values. These 2 are supposed to be classified as positive values. You can't solve this with a linear network. What I can do is consider this one neuron. It has 2 weights back to its input. I can draw those 2 weights as a vector in the input space. Maybe it points in this direction at initialization. And if this is a rectified linear neuron, it's going to be on for any of the examples that are in this, basically within 180 degrees of this vector, so these 2, and it's going to be off for these 2 down here. And so the gating idea just says, from the perspective of this one neuron, it's as though the data set just had these 2 neurons that it's active for. And we can solve the deep linear network problem corresponding to this reduced data set to get predictions about what this neuron will be doing. Now, some other neuron elsewhere in the network might point in this direction. And that's going to be active on just one example. It's off on all 3 of the others. And so if you imagine a very large neural network, at initialization, it has neurons pointed all over the place. And those will be seeing different subsets of the data set. And that's sort of the intuition behind how this works. You can now solve those linear problems and assemble the solution. So for the XOR task, it turns out that the gated deep linear network that will replicate the dynamics of a ReLU network looks something like this. It's very simple. It has these different pathways. Each box here can represent lots of neurons. So it's not a single neuron. It could be a whole bunch of neurons. But it's all of the neurons that are active only on the first training example. These are all of the neurons active only on the second training example, and so forth. And so it has these 4 pathways. And then each of these just behaves like a deep linear network. And with these ideas, we can now test the predictions of this model against just a standard simulation. So this is no longer an exact analysis, but it's a reduction that's hopefully quite accurate. So first, this in the red line here is a simulation of a real ReLU network, the standard PyTorch simulation. These are the weight vectors that it learns. You can see they point in these 4 input directions. And if I overlay the theory from assembling 4 different linear network problems on top of that, you can see it's not an exact match, but it's very close. So this is a little picture of how the ideas from the deep linear networks transfer partially to the nonlinear case. And just the thing we have to add is that they're not seeing the full data set. They're seeing subsets of the data set. There's a lot more to say about this. I've shown you cases where it works. There's lots of cases where it doesn't work. So there's a huge list of caveats for when you can complete this analysis. But there are situations where the nonlinear case behaves like this. OK, so as interim summary, shown that depth introduces saddle points into the loss landscape. And the dynamics slow near each saddle point. And that creates stage-like learning trajectories. And these saddle points are not just unstructured, they're arranged hierarchically. So you will learn the most important feature that explains the most variance in your data set first, before progressing on to the less important ones, for instance. And this yields a quasi-systematic progression through stages. Right? So most of the time, you're going just saddle point to saddle point. There may be places where there are several saddle points of equal value that you might go one way or the other. So there's some individual variability, but you see this broad progression through strategies. And then some of these ideas extend to nonlinear networks, and there's this idea that you sort of have a race between these different pathways. They're trying to explain the data set, and they're each seeing a subset of the data set. All right, so that was very theoretical. Thank you for bearing with me. Now let's see how these ideas might shed light on certain aspects of cognition. So I'll start with human semantic development. So semantic cognition refers to our ability to use and acquire generalizable knowledge over a lifespan, and it's knowledge of items and events that go beyond their perceptual properties. And the remarkable fact about children is that they acquire this knowledge over the course of development from seeing a parade of individuals, right? A child has only ever seen their neighbor's dog or one specific horse and so forth, and yet from this experience, eventually they come to understand that there's underlying hierarchical structure to the natural kinds. Maybe there's animals versus plants, one distinction, fish and birds, and so forth. So how do we go from this parade of individuals to this structured understanding of what's out there? And to look at this, we're going to connect neural networks and graphical models. So to formalize this theoretically, I now need a model of the world, and I'm going to model it as a probabilistic graphical model that has exactly a tree structure, okay? And so this tree structure here, the nodes would correspond to items, and items that are closer in the tree will be more likely to share properties. And so this is a little toy model of our world, and I can now draw a data set from that toy model and feed that to a deep linear network. And importantly, whereas you could simulate these networks, because we have these analytical solutions, in this setting, we can now simply say analytically how the structure in this graphical model will come to be embedded in the network without doing the simulations. Okay, so the basic setting, how this is working, we sort of have input items coming in. This is a very abstracted input. You could think of it as maybe something like higher level visual cortices. So you already know you're looking at a dog. It's not doing the classification piece. You already know you're looking at a dog. And the network is trying to predict what properties that dog has. Can it move? Is it big? Can it bark? So this is the setting. And there's a lot of empirical work out there that we would like this model to address. So I won't take you through any of these in detail, but just to say, of course, this is heavily studied by developmental psychologists. So there's a rich literature that of empirical findings that we can assess the model based on. And I'm just going to highlight one here. It's progressive differentiation. This is the observation that children tend to learn higher distinctions, like animal versus plant, before lower level distinctions, like dog versus cat. So this is still controversial. It's not completely universally accepted, but that's the idea. And the transitions between these stages can be reasonably abrupt and stage-like. Okay. So can our network capture this? Well, you might be seeing where this is going. For that hierarchical structure I outlined, one of those graphical models, it turns out that you're going to get one of these 1D chains in the network that corresponds to each level of the hierarchy. And each of those is going to go through one stage-like drop. And when it does, the network will learn that particular level of the hierarchy. And so indeed, this network will exhibit progressive differentiation. And I can visualize that here. On the left, I'm going to show the weights in the 1D chains coming up over time during learning. This is in a network trained on this hierarchical data set. And on the right, I'm showing the internal representation of the items in the network projected into 2 dimensions using MDS as a way of visualizing the representation within the layer of the network. And you can see that it elaborates a tree structure over learning, first learning this broad distinction in the tree before the finer distinctions later on. And each of these transitions is roughly stage-like, coming from expulsion from one of these saddle points. So the qualitative picture that emerges here is this is a network that essentially initially is grouping things just by whether they're animals and plants, and only later on manages to figure out that there's distinctions between fish and bird and tree and flower, and then later on still does the final layer of separation. Okay. And this is a fairly general principle for other hierarchies. It will follow this too. It depends on the exact statistics of the hierarchy, which levels will be learned, but it's something that you can characterize. And again, what's going on here is each of these times that a distinction is learned corresponds to one of the drops in the learning trajectory, and that's coming from expulsion from one of these saddle points, learning one of the 1D chains. All right, so this is all with a linear network, and it captures some features of the setting. But of course, semantic cognition also has to be controlled. So it's not appropriate to produce just everything you know about an item when you see it. You often want to just see a subset of the features be produced. And so as a starting toy model of this, with Devin Jarvis, in the lab, we've been looking at controlled semantic cognition building on this gated network formalism. So here the setting, we have a simple neural network. It receives its input item, but now it also receives a context telling it what items it should be producing. Maybe you're supposed to produce the visual properties of the item or the auditory properties of the item and so forth. And the target outputs of the network will now not just be a hierarchy that it's always supposed to produce. It will also include some outputs that are context specific. So these different columns are the 3 different contexts that we're going to consider, A, B, and C. And here, it's meant to produce a different context-specific set of outputs in these different domains. This is now a nonlinear task. And if I train just the deep linear network that we were looking at, you can see it goes through some stages at the beginning, but eventually it gets stuck, because all it can do is the best linear solution. But if I train a rectified linear neural network on this, eventually it can learn completely. And by doing this gated network analysis that I described before, it turns out that we can also describe the dynamics of this analytically in this particular case. And the way we did this was by finding the gating structure that reflected the gating structure that the ReLU network is learning. All right, so what did that look like? Well, this one surprised us a little bit. I thought it was going to be you have one pathway that's active always and captures whatever is shared across everything. And then you learn 3 context-specific pathways. But that's actually not what we found. We found that you learn these interesting pathways where 2 out of 3 of them are on for any given context, and they kind of mutually combine to give the right answers on all of these contexts. So it's an interesting midpoint between, you don't have fully context-specific neurons. They'll be active in multiple contexts, but they're also not just on in every context. It's an interesting mixture solution that we see. And this is also a place where I can highlight the nature of these dynamics as something of a race. So why does it learn this structure? Because it could have, you can find a network with 0 training error that solves the task that just has one shared backbone and then several context-specific pathways. So what I can do is build a network where I make these different pathways explicit. So these are these ones where they're on in 2 out of 3, and these are ones where they're on in just 1. And if I train this whole network together, gradient descent is trying to reduce the loss as fast as possible. And the point is just that these happen to learn slower. And therefore, they lose the race and they don't really participate. And so when we run the training process, and this is plotting the output coming from all of these different pathways, so it's the contribution to the output of these different pathways, you can see that the shared part learns most quickly. These dual context-specific pathways learn next, and at that point, there's no error left, and so these individual pathways just don't learn anything. Okay, So to summarize this section on semantic cognition, presented a very simple but exactly solvable model of development. And I think, to me, the interest in the model is how complex the dynamical phenomena are that arise just from depth, even with a static environment. So you might have thought a lot of the dynamics in development would come from changing input statistics, and that certainly happens in real life. But this is showing even with a fully static environment, you can have a complex progression that's coming just from the interaction of the learning algorithm with the architecture of the network. And the basic message that emerges is we have this hierarchical saddle point structure, and that can yield progressive differentiation, where you're learning the broadest distinctions first before the finest, and it happens in a roughly stage-like fashion. And context dependence might arise, at least in these models, it arises through this gating, and which representation the network settles on reflects this implicit race between different pathways. So there's a lot more that this model can capture about the empirical literature, but you catch me later if you're interested, but I won't have time to talk about it here. OK, so again, the picture that emerged from this is that we sort of have a hierarchy of saddle points, and the trajectory of learning will visit several of these. So finally, let's ask if we can observe this in a more controlled setting. So we're going to look at a task where we train mice over a long period of time and track the strategies that emerge through learning. So this is a task with Armin Locke at Oxford, and Sam Liebana led the project from my lab. It's a wonderful collaboration, and essentially what we've done, if you're familiar with it, is a variant of the International Brain Laboratory task. So here we have a mouse holding onto a little steering wheel, and we show it a computer screen, and we present a stimulus on the right-hand side or the left-hand side with a certain contrast. And the task of the mouse is just to turn the steering wheel to bring that object into the center. So it's just detecting what side of the monitor the stimulus is on and basically making a left or right response based on that. And if it's correct, it receives water reward. And the one change we made relative to the International Brain Laboratory task is we have no shaping, no curriculum. The task is completely static from trial one. So this is a case where any changes we see must be coming from the mouse interacting with the task. It's not coming from changing statistics of the environment. All right, so what happens? Well, over a period of about 30 days, the animals proceed from chance performance to what we'll call expert performance, 70% correct. We trained 28 mice here. You can see that there's a lot of variability, but there is progression over time. Here I'm plotting a psychrometric curve. So this is as a function of the contrast. What's the probability that the mouse is responding right? And you can see it proceeds from being roughly random, 50-50, to this nice strong slope here. So it's responding left if the contrast is negative. That's encoding the left direction. And it's responding right if the contrast is positive. But what interested us here is when we started digging into the individual trajectories. So let's consider these three mice in the rows here. So this first mouse, it starts off responding right all the time. So it's got a strong side bias. It's just always turning right. And in particular, you can see on day 7, that's quite a strong bias. And then later on, by day 15, you can see that this bias flips, all right? And this middle point here is the zero contrast point. That means a blank screen. So on the blank screen on day 7, when there's no visual stimulus, it used to be responding always right. But by day 15, it's responding always left, okay? And you can see it's detected the stimulus on this right-hand side. So we can sort of summarize this mouse's eventual strategy is it's looking for the stimulus on the right, and if it doesn't see it, then it spins the wheel the other direction. Now, this purple mouse does the flip. You can see it becomes left biased, and the zero contrast is initially responding on left, and then it flips to being right biased. So this mouse is adopting the strategy of look for the stimulus on the left. If I don't see it, eventually turn the wheel right. And some mice we see being nicely balanced. All right. So to summarize this more systematically, we can measure the slope, which will be the difference between their performance on zero contrast and the right two contrasts averaged together, and the bias, which is the performance on zero contrast. And this then lets us look at this population systematically, where this quite interesting structure emerges. So what we see here is that some animals really just pick up on the stimulus on the left. Some animals really just pick up on the stimulus on the right. And crucially, their initial bias early on in learning predicts which side they will pick up on the stimulus on, and also that their bias will reverse sign eventually. Okay? So here, if you started off a little bit right biased, you're going to pick up on the stimulus on the right, so your right slope will be large, and your bias will eventually flip sign, and the opposite for these other guys. All right. What this means is, if you tell me the early bias of the animal on day 7, say, we can tell you what its late bias will be with reasonable accuracy, and that's maybe 2 weeks in the future. So they're going through these very systematic progressions of behavior. We can also tell you, based on the early bias, which side of the stimulus they will eventually pick up on. Okay. So we would like to understand a bit more about why, right? Why is this happening? And so to get at this, we constructed a model. It's similar to the models I've been talking about, but modified a little bit, so let me tell you about the differences. So this is a deep RL neural network. So one difference is we switched from supervised to reinforcement learning. Otherwise, it's a deep linear network, so we're still making things very simple. And it's pretty much what a standard practitioner would do for a deep RL model, but with a couple tweaks. And the tweaks are, first of all, we have these segregated input channels in the first layer. So what that means is the network is not going to receive just a dense connectivity from input to hidden layer. It's getting these different anatomical connections, and we think this is reflecting the fact that, for instance, right visual input actually is anatomically segregated for a while in the mouse, and so forth. So this network just receives these 3 inputs. It's a constant bias input, stimulus independent, and it's whether there's a stimulus on the right and whether there's a stimulus on the left. So that's this very simple network. And it outputs the Q value, so the expected reward that it thinks it's going to get from taking a left action or a right action. And this goes through a softmax to determine its choice. And then the only other unusual feature of this network is that rather than predicting the total Q value, we, to match dopamine data here, had to assume that these predictions are made on the basis of a subset of the stimuli, so just the stimulus prediction or just the constant prediction. So there's these 2 different feedback signals, one which just knows about the constant input, one which just knows about the stimulus input, and otherwise it's just doing the standard Q learning updates. And with this now, we can simulate this model and compare it to our animals. And this model behaves qualitatively reasonably like the animals. So first of all, we see individual models coming sensitive to the left-hand side or to the right-hand side, just like the mice. And we also see this interesting pattern of first this bias emerges, then they become sensitive to the stimulus on the same side as the bias, and then the bias flips sign, and this other group of animals does the opposite, as it captures this full picture. All right. So I won't talk much about the neural data, but I will just mention we also have dopamine recordings, and this model captures those and how those evolve through learning as well. Okay, so probably the question in your mind is, okay, these match, but why? Do we really get insight out of this other than knowing we have a model that can capture these dynamics? Well, we can play this procedure out again of trying to find the saddle points in the loss landscape of this model. And when we do that, this is the picture that emerges. So each circle here is a saddle point. And these lines connecting them are the lines of steepest descent from that saddle point, which will connect to another saddle point. And what we see is, initially, at this saddle point, the network knows nothing. This is where all of the weights are 0. And from that point, there's sort of 3 saddle points that can come next. Either it's going to pick up on a right bias, so become very right biased, and it does this just by learning a connection from the constant input to the right bias, or it's going to become left biased. That's another saddle point. And then from that saddle point, it will progress through another sequence of ones, which eventually reach this configuration where now the sign of the bias has flipped, and the stimulus is now connected to the left-hand side in this case. So essentially, this sequence of saddle points reflects something of the sequence of strategies that the mice adopt when they're tackling this task. And so I think this dynamical picture is a nice summary of the learning dynamics that spells out the different strategies you expect to see and the transitions between them. And one important feature here is it's not that every animal is going to go completely lockstep through these, because really they live in this continuous space of weights and policies, so an individual could do any old thing here. But when you look at the population, the dynamics are influenced by this landscape structure, if this model is right, and then you'd see most animals broadly following these trajectories. So this is sort of a summary of the individual variability, but also the structure in the data set. All right, and as I sort of alluded to in the first part of the talk, these saddle points are arising through depth. So you might be saying, okay, but maybe every model would give me this, but every model won't give you these dynamics. In particular, if we just take out the hidden layer in our network and rerun this analysis, now there's essentially just one global minimum, and in this case, there are no saddle points, and so the network doesn't get stuck, and it very easily goes and finds this balanced solution. And in this case, you would not see mice that develop side biases. You would not see mice that just pay attention to the stimulus on one side and not on both, and that's in stark contrast to what this deep network is doing. Okay, so to summarize, we can capture sort of 3 weeks of learning trajectories and the systematic transitions that we see with a simple model. It's a deep linear reinforcement learning agent. And in particular, at the level of the data, we see that behavior is evolving through these systematic transitions through behavioral strategies, but there's still a lot of individual diversity in the animals. I haven't talked about the dopamine signals, but it turns out that we can also see this dopamine in this diversity in the dopamine signals as well. And this simple deep neural network model can capture this, and depth is really essential in getting this sequence of strategies and the progression between them. And the saddle point graph is a potential way of summarizing why we see this structure. Okay. So I think this is a very simple toy model, but it illustrates, again, this intuition that arises from the theory that essentially depth introduces this hierarchy of saddle points, which is telling us why it learns different strategies first. Like, why do all of the animals become side biased first? It's because that's a quick way of getting more reward initially. It's not the full task, but that's the highest level of saddle point. And then it goes through a sequence of incrementally reducing reward further from there. And we also have seen individual variability in this instance where there were certain places, particularly that first saddle point, where there were 3 possible strategies that were about equally good. And then it really is random fluctuations that decide where the animal goes, but then that put them on a systematic trajectory later on. Okay, so to summarize this talk and give some final thoughts, depth is a powerful influence on a learning system. We've seen it can introduce stage-like transitions in learning. And in particular, it causes dynamics to transition through this systematic sequence of saddle points. And I think this approach of trying to understand the fixed points graph of these dynamics, the learning dynamics, offers a compact description for how this learning will unfold. And I view that sort of similarly, these types of analyses are now very popular for recurrent networks. We're saying you can use a similar picture to understand what is ultimately also a dynamical system, which is the learning process. And I think the broad message emerging from this is that the behavioral strategies that you see will emerge from an interaction of architecture, learning, rule, and environment. That's sort of the core idea behind deep learning, and we've seen some examples of how rich that can be. Okay, so if you're interested to learn more, the theory work is mostly in this first reference, and this paper on arXiv describes the mouse experiment that I just told you about. And with my last few minutes, I want to talk about where things might go. So open challenges. So there are, of course, no shortage of open challenges. We really don't understand deep networks fully yet. But I would like to suggest that maybe we're beyond calling them black boxes, actually. We have partial insight into them. And I would say that's what we have in most scientific fields, actually. It's partial insight into our theories, even in physics, right? We don't understand. Like if you really wanted to model what a leaf falling from a tree, a specific actual leaf falling from a tree was going to do, this is immensely complex. You'd probably have to simulate it. It'd be very hard to do. So in physics, the approach we adopted was something more along the lines of what I've been laying out here and lots of other people have worked on. You look at surrogate models, and you get partial insight into how the system behaves. Okay, but what are the open challenges? Where do we need more understanding? First, we need to understand learning with prior knowledge. So this encompasses things like continual learning and transfer learning, curriculum learning. We need to understand learning in more complex network architectures. So I was just talking about feed-forward networks this whole lecture, and of course, that's not at all what the brain looks like. We need to be able to address much more complex topologies. There's some nice posters about that in this conference. And the approach I talked about with nonlinearity is just a start. We still need more understanding of what nonlinearity brings and some of these operations that are now in our modern systems, like attention. So this is a lot of future work that hopefully will happen, but I just want to highlight 3 that I think are particularly interesting and sort of came up in this conference. The first came from Mike Frank's talk yesterday. I think it's a surprisingly rich opportunity. There is a huge difference between how much a curriculum matters to an artificial neural network and how much it matters to animals, including humans. And we all want it to be the case that when we train our deep neural network with a curriculum, that's going to really change the representations and how quickly it learns. But a range of theoretical work has started to show, this is ours, but there's a wealth of other ones, that in fact, once you make networks large, artificial networks, curriculum basically doesn't matter. And so I think it's an important open question of can we develop algorithms that are better at exploiting curricula, because maybe this is part of why humans are more sample efficient than AI systems. That's at least one possibility that seems open here. Another open challenge is deciding how to learn. So in this rodent experiment, I was showing you that mice learn how to decide. But if you think about it, they also had to decide how to learn. Is this a task even worth engaging with? And how do I optimize my behavior so that I learn as fast as possible? And for an agent with a short lifespan, speed of learning, sample efficiency is critical. So there's some evidence that rats might engage in processes like this. And this is a nice review paper from Javier Macis and Sebastian Muslik if you want to read more about that perspective. And the final open challenge I'll highlight is multi-potential representation learning. So as animals are able to recombine their existing knowledge to do many new tasks, right? And I find it fascinating that that flexibility often emerges after a long period of learning. So if you start playing a guitar song, you maybe can just barely get through that one guitar song, but you can't then flexibly recombine that, do many different things. And through a long process of redescription and abstraction and who knows what else, eventually you would get the ability to cite, read, or improvise a new song. And I think that is a capability we have. So the idea of representational redescription from developmental psychology seems like a powerful one to think about in the context of machine learning. And basically asking, how do we learn one task in order to master many, right? Not just that one task we trained on. And if you're interested in this style of approaches, I'll just also plug, we have this analytical connectionism summer school running for the second year soon. And so if you liked what you saw and you want to engage with this community, trying to understand neural networks from this analytical point of view, then I hope you'll check out the future iterations of that. And with that, let me just thank my, my lab and funding sources, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Also come up to the microphones. We set up some extra microphones in the back so you don't have to walk so long. So, yeah.
Hey, yeah, right up front. Yeah, that was just a phenomenal talk. So one of the findings coming out of Jonathan Pilla's lab recently with Iris Stone is that when rats in the IBL task perform this task, they switch between different discrete strategies over time through something that looks like a hidden Markov model. And I'm wondering if I can think of your learning strategy as something like a race between experts, and whether it would predict that those experts still exist and you can switch between experts, or whether or not they get overwritten and forgotten in your architecture.
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are definitely a number of studies suggesting that you see discrete switching between strategies in various tasks. We would be sweeping over all of that because we are averaging to the like 50, 100 trial level already. So this is about the longer term strategy. So one possibility, maybe like you're saying, is it could be that there's, yeah, say a mixture of experts and it's the relative balance of strategies that we're modeling changing. However, I will say there's a nice, beautiful study by Peter Dayan and colleagues where they fit a model that could extract discrete strategy switches to the IBL task, the exact task we talked about, and essentially found no evidence of it. They found that animals had a disengaged state, so they would sometimes just give up. So that was a strategy switch that they saw. But their model could have detected animals trying being left biased for a while, trying being right biased for a while, paying attention to stimulus on the left, paying attention to stimulus on the right. And in their hands, they did not see that. They actually saw, this is very pleasing, they saw the same sequence that we saw, essentially. So I think it's not clear to me whether that exists in this particular task. Yeah.
Hi, Andrew. Really interesting talk. I have a lot of questions, but the first one is, in your semantic cognition slide, you showed how these neurons emerge that have a mixed selectivity for different contexts, and that's because they just happen to be easier to learn. And I was wondering if you can, I guess this is in contrast to how, if you were hand designing this, maybe back in the old connectionist days, you would probably have, a separate unit for each context. I was wondering if you can relate this to mixed selectivity in the brain and cortex that we see in a lot of cortical neurons, and also to contrast this with the kind of sparse representations that Jack Lindsay talked to us about on Wednesday that we see emerge in transformers, let's say.
Yeah. So on mixed selectivity, I think this is an interesting example of mixed selectivity it's not random, however. Right? So it's very structured. It's still mixed selectivity. So in neuroscience, I think sometimes mixed selectivity has been used to mean nonlinear, random, high-dimensional mixed selectivity. And you can get these networks to do that. The thing you have to do is initialize them with large weights initially. So I didn't really foreground this, but if you initialize networks with small weights, then you see the picture I told you about today. If you initialize them with large weights, you're putting them in this mixed selective regime. They already have random features to start. There's no reason to change that because it's sufficient to get zero training error if it's a large network. And so they leave those features fixed. This is the NTK regime, if you've heard of that. And so you can titrate between structured and random selectivity by adjusting the initialization. It's just one example of how important the prior knowledge you put in the network is. Even just the variance of the random initialization can switch it between those regimes. So yeah, you can use these models, I think, to sit anywhere between those points. And your second question, you might have to remind me.
Yeah. So on Wednesday, Jack Lindsay showed us how when you train these deep transformers on massive amounts of data, you see these very sparse. You're basically able to extract very sparse features forming highly selective features from the hidden layers. Like, for example, units that specifically represent the Golden Gate Bridge, for example. So
yeah, right. So,
you can speculate.
It's a good question. I haven't thought much about, what tasks would force the network into the sparse representation, and that probably is worth doing. Yeah. I mean, the other thing to say, obviously, we have no explicit regularization here. This is just training with gradient descent. So if you, I don't think they're doing that with transformers, but if you did explicitly have a sparsity constraint, then that might be another reason you'd see it. Yeah.
So in the talk, you showed that the saddle point occurs later in a deeper network. I'm wondering, do you think if the backpropagation plays a role in this feature?
Yeah, I mean, we are exactly studying the consequences of backpropagation. So the initial saddle point is, so the actual saddle point is when the weights are exactly 0. If you imagine the weights being not quite 0, but very small, then this is precisely when you have vanishing gradient. So the saddle point and that initial delay is the vanishing gradient problem reflecting in the dynamics. So yeah, this is absolutely that.
So as you see, in your talk, you also show that the mouse have a similar learning dynamics as the neural network. Do you think if that also speaks to maybe they use similar learning strategy like backpropagation as the network?
Yeah, I should have included this as the open challenge, actually. I think this is the empirical question for me right now, is can we find a way of testing that? So yeah, what I showed you is consistent with mice using backpropagation. But that doesn't mean that's what the mice are doing. We need many more experiments to see if there could be other alternative explanations. I really just showed you one. We have worked on a couple extra, but understanding how you can make an experimental case for or against backpropagation, given its central importance in engineering and in neuroscience and psychology, seems like, to me, a major open empirical challenge. Yeah, which we're working on. Yeah.
Thank you.
I have a question to the second part. So you mentioned that it was surprising to see the context-specific nodes learning a mixture. I'm wondering, does that, in your intuition, depend on whether it's a bottom-up learning or a top-down learning structure?
Yeah.
Because you give the input you mentioned in the very beginning are dogs, and the network knows it's a dog, and it has a kind of another representation than when it doesn't need to learn certain categorical structures behind that.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, it's possible the picture would change if you were forcing it to jointly do the categorization. Yeah, that's definitely possible. Yeah, but I guess, I mean, I'm not sure, maybe it shouldn't have been surprising to me, but it was, I think it was just surprising because the context input we give it is this individuated, like, context A, context B, context C, so it just seemed natural, like, I could write down by hand what the solution would be if it adopted that, and that's not what it turned out to do, yeah. Oh.
Hi, I like the hierarchical saddle point idea very much, but it also seems to me that it only works if the ball, let's say the neural trajectory, if the ball drops at the same time, the same location every time, right? So you can imagine if it drops somewhere else, it will lead to nonsensical decisions. So if you sort of say manipulate the neuronal activity, for example, do you have evidence either for or against that?
Yeah, so the initial point that you drop the ball on the surface is about how you initialize your network. So these networks are usually quite large, so there's something like a law of large numbers applying. So if you initialize them, even with random weights, the position that they start at is basically bang on the same every single time because they're large, so it sort of averages out. But if you change the initialization, yeah, you could start further or closer from the local minimum, or you can start at a saddle point you wouldn't normally visit. All of these things are possible they're in the landscape. And so the trajectory you take depends on where you start very much. Yeah.
Thank you. That was cool, thanks. I imagine humans would show very different trajectories on that task. And I wonder whether you think there are things you can do with this framework to understand anything about how humans would do it, or if you just need to do something totally different.
You mean humans doing the mouse task?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a great, I think humans will not get side biased. They will immediately appreciate the symmetry in the task.
Exactly.
And it's a little stunning to me the mice don't. If you take these theories completely literally, then one thing you could say is, okay, in this case, humans are essentially shallow. The shallow network is always balanced. I don't know that that makes much sense, but if you take the theory literally, that's what it would be. And then, of course, I think humans are just bringing way more than, we have so many learning processes. It's clearly not going to be just this type of long-term, slow connection adjustment. So maybe when we do this task, we're not even changing weights, it's something else entirely. Yeah.
Thank you for the great talk.
So my question is about like the initialization problem. Like for doing theory purposes, like most of the time we make some assumptions about the initializations, either you make it aligned or very small, and you find these results are both analytically tractable and sometimes comparable to biology. Do you think these assumptions are like really biological, or it's just like serious tools to make their theory work?
It's a great question, because what does it mean for the brain to have small weights? I mean, that also doesn't, it's not very clear to me. I think the way I try to phrase it right now is, it appears as though there are cases where it behaves as if it has small weights. And I don't know if we're missing something about the mapping and it's not actually small weights, but there's some other mechanism that makes it behave similarly, or if it really is, because, yeah, I agree, it seems a bit surprising.
Or the alignment, like it's...
So the alignment, I think, this is a very technical point, but these solutions rely on an assumption that the initialization is also aligned, which won't happen for random weights. However, the alignment process is usually fast. So I think that is less of an assumption just because it happens quickly, so you can sort of ignore it unless you need to consider it. And the intuition there is, if your weights are very small, but they're pointed in the wrong direction, then just a very small nudge, they'll snap to the right direction, I think is the intuition. So the smaller your weights, the faster they align, basically. Yeah.
Thanks so much for insights.
Thank you for the great talk. I think I have a stupid question about chicken versus egg. So do you think the settle point caused the learning, or the vice versa, as learning as a signature settle points suddenly arise? And if the settle point caused the learning, like what kind of things that do you expect to see in the data set, if that is the case?
Right. So just make sure, you said, does the saddle point cause the learning? This might be above my pay grade. I feel like causality with mathematics is very tricky because, yeah, I think you'd have to ask someone who knows more about causality than me. I would sort of say it's arising simultaneously, right? It's like, it's not, a saddle point is probably not a cause. It's just the consequences of running these equations, and it sort of exists simultaneously with all of it. Yeah.
Thanks. I'm just wondering if your theory gives some intuition about why we want networks to be deep. Like, why depth?
Yeah. I kind of showed you just that they're bad, right? You make your network deep, you get biased, you don't ignore the stimulus on one side.
Yeah, it seems like it would be good to learn in a single stage as quickly as possible.
Right. So I didn't show you the good side. There is a good side, which is when you learn a structured representation, you can then use that to generalize. And if you have a structured representation, like you've learned the hierarchy in your hidden layer, and now I add one new item, you can slot that in faster, potentially, and extend it appropriately. So depth is essential. I just didn't show you many of its benefits, but it has a lot of benefits in terms of generalization, and I think that's the main benefit. Yeah.
So there seems to be a gradient between simple animals and animals like us, where, for example, in lobsters, you have a predetermined stomatogastric ganglion. The weights are all the same from one lobster to the next. The lobsters, eat and grind up their food, whereas we have to adapt to a lot of different situations. And I think the big weights to small weights thing, the big weights are learned by evolution, and then as we get more complex, we need smaller weights to start. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And I find it striking that, you know, like you're saying, there's so many animals that have a lot of genetically encoded abilities, and if anything, it seems like it kind of mostly went out of humans, which I still find that a bit mysterious. And I mean, one way to rationalize it would be that's because the benefits of being a learning system that can learn it online and then generalize in whatever niche you're actually exposed to are so great that it was better than having sort of specific large weights built in. Yeah.
One other question, you know, during learning, ReLU units may or may not, you know, they'll switch on and off, and so does that play any role? I mean, in your theory, you start with a set of ReLU units that are specific to a situation, but over time learning with backprop, things switch in and out. How much difference does that make, or do you find that it pretty much, this doesn't happen as much as one might expect?
Yeah, so if you train a network on ImageNet, about 20% of its ReLUs are switching their activation on some training example, even at the end of training on each epoch. So it's actually a large fraction are chattering. They're like switching. Huh. And that's why we can't use this to just tell you what the dynamics on ImageNet is. I wish we could, but it's not possible. So where this strategy works is one of the caveats is where things rapidly align and then which neurons are active stays pretty much fixed. That's the easiest place to apply it. And one of the more complicated things that can happen is a neuron can chatter, switch every epoch which items it's active on.
That's a really cool statistic. I did not know that. Yeah.
Yeah.